Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the fourth of our special webinar series on the impact of the pandemic on women and girls in developing countries. This series aims to engage researchers, policymakers, and practitioners on matters around women's empowerment and the impact that the pandemic and the associated economic crisis has had on women in the global South. Today, we will address the impact that the COVID crisis has had on gender-based violence. We will hear from three panelists who will speak to us about recent empirical trends and the deep challenges in collecting data, for instance. The increases in gender-based violence are a serious cause for concern on their own. The long-term consequences of this trend are especially worrisome when lockdowns restrict the support that victims might normally access. And as we have seen in our previous webinars, this topic is deeply intertwined with other dimensions of women's lives, such as their engagement in labor markets, the double burden of work and care, fertility, intra-household dynamics, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and more. The Women's Empowerment and Development Lab at McGill University is immensely grateful for the generous support of Canada's International Development Research Centre through its Growth in Economic Opportunities for Women, GROW, which is a 5-year action research program jointly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and IDRC, in order to find scalable solutions for advancing gender equality in the world of work. Working with partners in East Africa, the program focuses on 3 areas, though our series does take a more global approach as well. So the 3 areas are addressing gender segregation and employment, reducing and redistributing unpaid care work, and unleashing women's collective agency. While we are meeting virtually, the series and the lab are hosted by McGill University, which is located on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet virtually today. So before introducing our panel, just a quick reminder of today's run of show. We're going to do things slightly differently than we have in the previous webinars. We are going to allow our panelists to speak for 15 minutes each, after which I will moderate a question and answer. And do remember that there is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and so feel free for the participants to go ahead and ask questions as they come up. So with that, I would like to now introduce our first speaker. Catherine Yunt is Asa Griggs Candler Chair of Global Health and Professor of Global Health and Sociology at Emory University. Her research centers on the social determinants of health, including mixed methods evaluation of social norms and empowerment-based programs to reduce gender-based violence with health disparities in underserved populations. Dr. Yunt is founding director of GROW. Now, I think this is a different GROW than the GROW from an initiative to advance scholarship, leadership, and social change with respect to women's and girls' empowerment, the prevention of gender-based violence, and women's health. So, Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. A very synergistic GROW group. So delighted to be here and such an important conversation to be having in this timely way. So I'm delighted to participate and look forward to the discussion. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll be talking a little bit today, providing an overview of violence broadly and how family violence and violence against women and girls is situated in that broader context. Also discussing what is a widely known and important social ecological framework for understanding the causes of violence against women and girls, and then situating our understanding of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic in general, but also what the CDC has called non-pharmaceutical risk mitigation strategies on these risks for women and girls. There's actually been quite an outgrowth of initial research to understand the impacts of COVID-19 and NPRM strategies on violence against women and children. So I'll share a bit of that, talk about some important limitations of that research and how we can carry this agenda forward collectively into the future, and then talk about some promising opportunities for prevention. So just as a very broad overview quickly, this is a schematic from the World Health Organization early report on violence, situating interpersonal and family violence in particular in a broader context of self-directed violence, which actually is also a risk in the context of COVID-19 and risk mitigation, collective violence, which also is a risk, but honing in on the particular risks that occur within families to children, girls in particular, women in partnerships, and also older women and older adults in the context of COVID-19. So just to briefly define family violence broadly, and then to situate it as a gendered social problem. We're referring broadly to abusive behaviors in which one individual gains power or control over another. So we are situating this squarely in a context of power and control in relationships. Family violence includes a number of different types of violence, and probably best known as intimate partner violence, which tends to be a burden that women face globally. And that encompasses a broad array of acts, including physical, sexual, psychological, and economic aggression or deprivation by a current or former married, cohabiting, or dating partner. And I did want to underscore the risks of economic coercion and aggression because of some of the economic implications of lockdown and risk mitigation strategies for working women. Child maltreatment encompasses emotional, physical, and sexual abuse or neglect of anyone less than 18 years of age by a parent, a custodian, or caregiver that results in actual harm, the threat of harm, or potential harm to that child. And then finally, elder abuse would be failure to act or an intentional act by a caregiver that causes or creates a risk of harm to a person 60 years or older. All of these forms of family violence are gendered, which I will show in just a minute, and all of them have risks that are potentially elevated in the context of COVID-19. So to situate empirically this discussion about differential risk for all of these forms of gender-based family violence, I just wanted to share briefly 3 slides that depict systematic reviews of the evidence with respect to particular forms of violence in each of these categories of family violence. The first here is a systematic review by Stoltenberg and colleagues from 2011, demonstrating across the globe, and in particular in Australia, Europe, as well as the US and Canada, the disproportionate risk of girls to child sexual abuse in the context of home and families. There are other forms, certainly, of violence against children. I'll mention briefly child marriage as another form of gender-based violence that is facing particular risks in low-income countries where child marriage continues to be prevalent, particularly among girls. And here are global estimates, very well known by DeVries and colleagues from 2013, of intimate partner violence against women, showing roughly across regions that 1 in 3 women in their lifetime experience some form of physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner. I hesitated to present differentials between men and women because those differentials are highly contentious. And as a discussion in and of themselves in the context of the United States, but generally speaking, the position of the World Health Organization and others is that these are experiences that are disproportionately burdened by women across the globe. And then finally, with respect to global estimates of elder abuse, I thought it was very interesting to point out, and this is probably not as common a topic in discussions about gender-based violence, so it's worth noting. is that in Asia and the Pacific region, as well as the Eastern Mediterranean region, there is some evidence of disproportionate burden of elder abuse among women relative to men, although rates are, of course, of all of these forms of violence unacceptably high, and a rights violation for all people. So to situate gender-based violence that occurs within families and households in broader social ecological context, I just wanted to briefly present the social ecological model, and I've underscored areas of this model where COVID-19, as well as risk mitigation strategies, could exert disproportionate impact on the conditions that can elevate risk of violence. So the social ecological model situates the woman, the girl, at the center of our attention, and identifies multiple levels of influences that can be a cause for multiple forms of gender-based violence. Individual factors might include a history of childhood experience of violence for the woman, as well as the partner or the perpetrator. A history of mental health conditions that could be socially induced or genetically induced, and importantly, attitudes condoning or justifying violence as a normal or acceptable occurrence. And I actually would underline this cause of violence as well in the context of COVID-19 because of some of the conditions that emerge under lockdown, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Interpersonal factors can and do include high levels of inequality, not just economic dependence of women or girls on their partners or families, but also situations of unexpected or what we call status inconsistency, where women are the primary economic providers in the home, and that can create threats to norms of masculinity and can induce violence. And we found that relationships of dependence and status inconsistency to be associated with experiences of violence among women. I'll just mention community factors because they are so important in this context. Harmful gender norms that uphold ideas related to male rights and privilege and that limit women's empowerment. High levels of poverty and unemployment, which are a tremendous concern now after periods of lockdown and some concern about a re-lockdown, particularly in the United States, as a part of global conversations. High rates of violence and crime, which is a concern now as well. And then finally, societal factors. I would actually place gender norms in this part of the schematic as well. Importantly, though, we're talking here about discriminatory laws with respect to property ownership, low levels of women's employment and education at the societal level, and absence or lack of enforcement of laws addressing violence against women. This has been identified as a particular concern in the context of COVID, given the strain on resources and capacity to continue to support this essential service. So in terms of the kinds of impacts of the COVID pandemic and non-pharmaceutical risk mitigation strategies, just very quickly in the interest of time and discussion, families that are in quarantine, experiencing isolation, even physical distancing, as well as the expanded demands for domestic labor, and unpaid child and elder care as a result of closures of institutions have placed tensions and anxieties on stress on all of us. And for those who are in compounding conditions of poverty, compounding conditions of delayed unemployment benefits, et cetera, these tensions and anxieties can be exacerbated. Households, millions of households, billions of households around the world are facing financial strains, depending upon the rapidity, the severity of lockdown conditions, experiencing disruptive losses of employment, losses of income, and even other assets as they have to be sold to meet basic needs during lockdown. Families, and in particular men and young boys, are staying at home, may have higher exposure to the use of online sexually explicit material that portrays violence against women. This is actually an area of research interest to us. And so the isolation compounded by internet connectivity can actually increase exposure to acts against women that are considered forms of social learning that can influence men's and young boys' behavior. Restrictions on mobility disrupt both prevention programs as well as important forms of social support for women. Services that mitigate risks directly of violence, such as mental health services and substance abuse treatment, violence shelters, have been severely challenged by closures and by the demands for resources. I understand anecdotally from colleagues of mine that work in those settings. And as prevention efforts adapt to online delivery, women and girls become exposed to cyber violence. I wanted to just summarize or just portray very briefly that there has been an outpouring already of efforts to understand the relationships between either the pandemic in general, but in particular the risk mitigation strategies that have been deployed around the world on risks of violence. What I will point out, and we can talk about in the discussion, is that the findings at this point are really very mixed. Part of that has to do with differences in methodology, the availability only of cross-sectional data, the use of administrative or formal report systems to try to estimate levels of violence. We know that some of those formal reporting systems are subject to substantial underestimation of women's and girls' exposure to violence in the home. So what we see across these two slides is that there is some evidence from some studies of increases in violence against women, some evidence of no change, also evidence of decrease. And so what I will point out in addition is that these studies are subject to a fairly narrow geographic scope. They have methodological challenges that I mentioned. Also, there has not yet been a very robust linkage between the timing of lockdowns of different forms and changes in reporting of violence by women and girls. There also has been a limited focus on violence against girls specifically, which I think is important to point out. And finally, there are questions about the extent to which the risks that are incurred by a lockdown and the inability, the loss of social support, the loss of access to services may actually diminish the confidence with which women have to report experiences of violence. So the decreases could be a function as well of a sense of risk of reporting formally experiences of violence that are actually happening. So our current research strategies are threefold. One is to address the narrow geographic scope of existing studies. So we're conducting a national review of print media and linking those reports of women's and girls' experiences of violence directly to the timing of different lockdown orders, both in the United States, and the intent or the aspiration to do this globally. To address the methodological issues of cross-sectional data and limited data sources, to conduct what we call difference in difference analysis of both domestic violence calls, as well as self-reports of violence against women, which are considered more of a gold standard, and linking those directly to state-level non-pharmaceutical risk mitigation executive orders in the United States, with the aspiration also of going global. And then finally, to address the cross-sectional design, limitations of data sources, and limited data on violence against girls, in some longitudinal intervention studies that we have underway in lower income settings in South Asia, to understand how experiences of lockdown, the economic demands that result within families, and possibly the risk of violence against girls in the forms of even earlier child marriage in settings where child marriage is common. Then just to wrap up, there are a number of prevention strategies that we can place at the forefront that address the normative and the structural demands on families that occur during lockdown. We can create awareness and messaging to influence and circumvent harmful gender norms that may be distributed through the media, and in particular through exposure to explicit content. We can leverage remote learning opportunities during distance education for children. We can continue with or adapt community mobilization efforts by relying on distance-based strategies such as radio or television or social media. Engage employees who are able to work from home and to relay messages about the importance of mitigating violence against women and girls, to define, importantly, public health services as essential services in all states and in all nations, and to adapt modes of delivery to ensure that these services are available to women who have restricted mobility. And importantly, finally, to provide economic and livelihood support to women and households while being mindful that the provision of economic support needs to be combined with normative strategies to ensure that those resources remain appropriately in the hands of women. So thank you all, and I welcome and look forward to the panel's presentations and discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. All right, I'd like to now turn or pass the mic, so to speak, to our next panelist, Wilson Hernandez. Wilson Hernandez is adjunct researcher at GRADE, the Group for the Analysis of Development in Lima, Peru. He holds a bachelor's in economics and a master's degree in comparative development studies from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in France. His research topics cover gender-based violence, crime victimization, fear of crime, and geospatial analysis of crime, as well as public policy evaluations, and has just published a book a few months before the pandemic hit on these topics in Peru. So Wilson, I'll turn the floor to you.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for the invitation also. I'm going to share my screen. Yes. Okay. I'm going to present you a preliminary results on this research that we are conducting with INACIEN. INACIEN is the National Domestic Violence Hotline in Peru, and approximately it receives 10,000 calls per month. And you might know what's happening in several countries that almost all services and address to and the domestic violence helpline have attention because it's easy to continue to deliver this type of service. So the title of my presentation is Does a virus change who calls to a national domestic violence helpline? And in fact, it is not the virus, it is the lockdowns and the aggressors behind this problem. And I will try to explain the complexity of this chart that is very interesting to understand what happened. This is the number of calls received by INACIEN since 1917 until April this year. In Peru, okay. In Peru, we have started a lockdown in mid-March, March 16. So we don't have enough data. That is one of the problems we are facing now with the research, but we are waiting for the microdata I'm going to tell a little more about it. So, as you can see, the trend is upwards. It's very interesting because it's kind of capturing areas, and it's not a very well positioned service in Peru. And I want to comment you a little bit about the context of violence against women in Peru. It's a recent paper published by Bott and colleagues where they published the DHS, the Demographic and Health Service results of most Latin American countries. And as you can see, Peru ranks 4th in this rank of lifetime prevalence of physical and sexual intimate partner violence. And as you can see now, this is the national estimates for Peru of the lifetime prevalence of this physical and sexual intimate partner violence. All statistics are declining. So it's kind of positive, but the rate of decrease is kind of very, very slow. And the main question is what happened to violence against women in Peru after the lockdown? I'm going to concentrate in intimate partner violence. One of the particular characteristics of the quarantine, of the lockdown here, is that it lasted a lot, more than 100 days, and we had 5 extensions, and the last extension is really a focused lockdowns on certain regions, not anymore at the national level like it was with the previous one. So it's a long previous where we might ask if what could have happened for intimate partner violence to increase. And I think there are 5 interesting issues that we need to raise here. An increasing violence against women might appear if there's isolation in general, and lockdown gives this perfect isolation so that aggressors can start increasing tension and increasing different forms of violence. Economic stress is also a second reason of why this type of violence might increase, and we are our economy is very informal. A lot of people suffer because they lost jobs, and economic stress is very high at these moments. Normalization of violence is a third issue very present in Peru, and we have national data saying, for example, that young people, I mean students from university, half of them approve hitting their partner for any reason it might appear. Traditional gender roles, it's kind of very related to the previous issue, and it was already a common problem in Peru in terms of intimate partner violence. So what happened to this problem? Kind of the obvious answer is there was an increase. We don't have, obviously, the administrative data. Police reports, police stations were open, but there were no incentives or major motivations for a victim to go to these police stations. We have also the emergency centers for women who were also in lockdown. It's a state service delivered by the Ministry of Women, and the only service we have active is this famous Línea 100, the domestic violence helpline. Before the lockdown, La Línea 100 it had 202 operators, received approximately between 8,000 and 10,000 calls per month. Most of operators are male, and most of the people who call also are female. But as I told you before, it's not a very well-known service. Most of the calls come from the main city, Lima, 60% of them. However, Lima only concentrates a third from the national population. A recent paper from Jorge Agüero, he analyzed data from Línea 100, and he found with different methods a 9% increase in the calls received by this service. So it's very interesting because it's kind of a rigorous way of saying that effectively it's capturing some calls or some problems of intimate partner violence. And he also found that there's bigger increases in regions where the lockdown was more pronounced. So it's kind of a very important fact to say that the stronger the lockdown, the harder hit on intimate partner violence. But I think that in order to properly analyze this issue, we cannot directly trust these results as we need to see these to additional problems. What is the motivation to call? In which moment towards change are victims? I mean, there's this old paper of Prochaska that change is a sequential steps of pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, and action to take something on. And maybe lockdown is some women are in different steps of this process of change, and the lockdown may appear in maybe most like in pre-contemplation, where they have no idea of that that the hitting, that the violence against her is really a violence. And the other important point here is an intimate partner typology. Johnson published a couple of papers, important papers on this, and he found that not all victims are the same, but there are at least 4 patterns of victimization. One of the less severe is what he called the common situational violence, and in the other case you have the intimate terrorism, kind of very severe violence. And in a paper for Peru, we found for typology, 4 types of intimate partner violence. And I raise this issue because I think that lockdown generates different incentives in these subtypes of victims in order to try to call Línea 100 or in general to report a crime in police. So what we are doing is try to tackle these 3 objectives of the Línea 100. Who are calling? What is the difference in women that call before and women that call after the lockdown? Why do they report, or what types of violence do they report? And if it is just, or if the problem is that we have more intimate partner violence cases, or we have just more calls, it's kind of more attention given to the Línea 100. This is kind of a detailed structure of what I'm telling you here. And one of the important things of who calls is that maybe not every case was a domestic violence case, but there's people calling for information in general in terms of what the Línea 100 does. And what do they report? As I told you, with this intimate partner typology can generate selective incentives for certain types of intimate partner violence to rise. So my hypothesis is that more victims than third parties are calling to the Línea 100, and there's an increase in less severe calls. The third question we cannot answer yet because we are in the middle of the research, and I tell you why exactly. Right now we are working with administrative records, and it's monthly data from the last 2 years and the piece of it. So the sample is very small because it's monthly data. But we are waiting for micro data that will come in a couple of weeks because we are working this with the Ministry of Women. So for now, what I can present you is the results of this first part of the analytical strategy, that is a difference in difference estimation following Agüero recommendations. And what we don't have enough information yet is the regression design, in which we are going to compare the before and after every extension of the lockdown and what happened to the structure of calls. So what happened at the descriptive level with the Línea 100? What I am presenting here, as you can see, is that the proportion of female and male callers to the Línea 100 has kind of been almost the same, and we can say we can see a similar pattern in terms of the sex of the victim. So there are not kind of structural changes, at least in the descriptive level. But we can see, as it is shown in this chart, that at least in the last month, and it is the last piece of these lines, there's a decrease in the proportion of psychological violence, and increase in the proportion of physical violence. But it may be just regression to the mean, because we have monthly variation and we cannot be 100% sure. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about this graph later because I'm running out of time. And these are the linear regression results. It's preliminary. We don't have still the micro data to have some results from this. I think some universities are already found. So we have a set of dependent variables, and our variable of interest is the interaction between the year 2020 March before the lockdown and April, the first month after lockdown. And here are the results. This is the first question: who called after the lockdowns? And what we can see here is that in March there's not evidence of statistical significance, but in April we more calls. But as you can see in this highlighted statistics, there might not be there's not a statistical difference between the proportion or the ratio between females and males and the proportion of female callers. So we have more calls, but not necessarily more from equal women. In this slide, what you can see is that the dependent variables are the ratio between female and male victims and the percentage of female victims. In the previous one, we have the callers, not necessarily victims. And we see no difference between before and after the lockdown. When we ask who is the aggressor, we have now some interesting results to share here, because the calls concern more men as aggressors than victims as aggressors. And this is interesting because in the next slide, in this one, as you can see, there is this unknown sex of aggressors that is probably highlighting that there's a number of calls that concern women that are battered by their partners, but are not able maybe to disclosure who are very fearful of trying to recommend their cases to Línea 100 operators, or maybe the service is kind of Línea 100 is delivering a bad service, no? And it cannot complete all the information needed for their administrative records. This is the second question of the research, and is what do they report? And we can see there is more psychological violence reported to the Línea 100, but less physical and less sexual violence reported to this service. And it kind of it's in line with what I was expecting in terms of the less severe violence, psychological violence, might be capturing the attention of Línea 100, and the more severe cases, the physical and sexual violence, are kind of going back and not reporting it to the proper services. And it may reflect that we cannot conclude that intimate partner violence is an homogeneous piece of phenomenon, but in fact we have to understand that there are subgroups of victims that can face different incentives as a consequence of the difference in the violence they suffer. So just to give you a conclusion from these preliminary results, we have more calls and more female victims, but there's kind of this hidden victim because Línea 100 is not capturing the unknown sex of aggressors, and this might be signaling another type of problem. Maybe, as I told you, a poor service given, shorter calls, or fearful victims. We have more psychological violence and less physical and sexual violence, and it might reflect that there's an intimate partner typology that is reacting in a different way, different ways in terms of after the lockdown, or it may capturing that the Línea 100 marketing during this month that has been very strong, only less severe callers. Of course, there are limitations, a small sample and counterfactual availability. We don't have it. It may be solved with the next steps. That we have to replicate this with the microdata, daily, monthly, by region, and also using regression discontinuity designs to see how they change, if there are some changes before and after each lockdown extension. And only to finish, I have to say that what to look in future, you have to understand how to use guidelines, because it's not as easy as giving marketing campaigns to put the reflectors on this service, and try to understand the effectiveness of this service, and why is there some women that decide not to use it. Well, thank you, and I'm open to the question and answers in a couple of minutes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Wilson. Great presentation. I would like to now turn the virtual mic to Chichi Undie, who is a senior associate with the Population Council, where her work focuses primarily on sexual and gender-based violence and girls' education. For the last decade, she has directed and provided strategic and technical oversight for Africa Regional SGBV Network, a multi-country, multi-partner SGBV response research and research uptake initiative in East Horn and Great Lakes region. The network designs, implements, and evaluates innovative response models in low-resource settings, including in refugee contexts. She is the chair of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. So Chichi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Is it up?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Chichi Undie, and I'm really pleased to be able to give this presentation on behalf of Liz Dartnell, who happens to be the executive director of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. She couldn't be with us today. The SVRI has put together a new series of briefs, which it refers to as the SVRI Knowledge Exchange. And this presentation is based on one of the briefs, which should be made publicly available this month, I believe, and it shares the same title as this presentation, Remote Data Collection on Violence Against Women, which I'm calling VOW for short, during COVID-19. So what is the issue, or what really brought about the need to put together a brief on this particular subject? I should say that these series of briefs are focusing on really topical issues around VOW in the time of COVID-19. But one of the key issues is whether we can safely and ethically measure the impact of COVID-19 on VOW during lockdown situations. This concern comes up because of the need, the curiosity, and really the importance of understanding issues such as prevalence and incidence when it comes to violence against women. These are issues that are extremely difficult to measure, even in the best of circumstances, but it is important information to have. When you consider the subject of violence against women, though, and the fact that we are in a really complex pandemic, issues of accuracy around measuring these things come to the fore. In addition, we know that generating high quality and reliable data on violence against women really requires a high level of expertise, intensive training, even for several weeks at a time, explicit protocols to ensure that survivors or participants are protected during data collection, and referral systems or referrals are embedded within violence against women data collection, just on an ethical basis. And as previous speakers have mentioned, referrals are changing right now. They are limited, oftentimes they are virtual, and so on and so forth. And we really don't know enough about how they are actually working. So the point is that there are lots of questions that come up when we think about measuring violence against women, prevalence and incidence specifically. And it leads us to really send out a word of caution about measuring such things at this time. The picture I'm sharing up here is a picture from, it could be a research setting for many of us, and I think it sort of vividly shows the kinds of settings where we collect our violence against women data in the Global South, oftentimes in low resource settings within the Global South. But the issues outlined here on this slide, I would like to say, could really apply to any kind of setting or household. It doesn't matter how glamorous the household is. All of these issues apply. Right now in the time of COVID-19, there's this inability to conduct in-person interviews with women in a private location. Referral services, as I mentioned previously, they are limited right now. Psychosocial support, which is really critical, is also limited. Some governments are not considering gender-based violence services to be essential at this time. So there's a whole range of issues, a whole range of challenges that we face when we think about measuring VOW right now. A previous speaker talked about the high levels of stress, all kinds of stress experienced in households right now. And there's also the risk that in settings such as the one on this picture, and even in settings that might look better resourced than this one, there's always that risk that perpetrators will overhear the interview or the interview process with the responses and retaliate during this period of lockdown. And so it really is a difficult decision-making process when it comes to the issue of deciding to collect data and collecting data remotely, remember, on violence against women during this time. But I think the main message to take away is that we really should never prioritize data or the collection of data over women's safety. That's the bottom line. And so there are a lot of different questions that we should be asking ourselves before we embark on such a venture. And so all of these realities are really what has sparked the need for this particular brief, which will be released shortly, as I mentioned earlier. And the brief contains an outline of 5 core foundations for safety and data quality when you are using remote methods. And they're listed here. It's really important to select your method appropriately, paying attention to all kinds of ethical issues that could come up. It's important to adapt and redefine our research protocols, given that for the most part, the research protocols around violence against women were based on face-to-face data collection practices. That has changed radically right now. And so we really need to think about what it means to collect the same kind of data remotely. There are additional training considerations, and we also need to revisit certain measures, and of course, prioritize the well-being of researchers. I'm going to be talking about each one of these right away. So this slide on selecting your remote method, I know it's a bit busy, and the goal isn't for anyone to sort of get lost in the weeds here, but I just want to draw your attention to the top row. Just to mention that there are a range of remote data collection methods, probably more that are mentioned here. But what you see on the the left column is basically a number of issues to be considered and issues that help you really decide what kind of remote method would work best for you. I'd like to spend a bit of time here talking about adapting our research protocols. We need to think of questions such as how and where our interviews will take place if we're collecting data remotely, especially when you consider the need for space, not just for the participant, but for the researcher as well, who's collecting the data. There is that need for space. There is that need for no distractions. And when we think about collecting data remotely, we also need to think about the informed consent process. So it really is a totally different ballgame. Oftentimes when we talk about remote data collection, we're thinking about phones, for instance. That may probably be one of the most common ways. And if you are making a phone call to a potential participant, we need to think about a graduated consent process, given that you never know who actually will pick up the phone, and you never know how many people the phone needs to go to before it gets to the actual participants. So there has to be a sort of a layered informed consent process. And how do we assess privacy and safety when we're not there ourselves? There are ways to do this, but these are things that we need to take into consideration as we adapt our research protocols for this pandemic period. Another thing to think about is what strategies interviewers will use to establish trust and rapport. We take it for granted that we have very well-trained teams that know how to do this already, but in the if you're considering remote data collection, it really is a concern. How do you do that when you don't actually, you're not seeing the person face to face? It's sort of a very different way of thinking and a very different way of doing things and a very different skill set. Which our research teams are probably not used to yet. What if something happens? What if, how do you respond if the participant is suddenly subjected to stress or is in danger and you're really not there? These are all the kinds of things that we need to think about and build into our protocols. What if there's emotional distress? How will we know if there is? We know that with violence against women studies, this is often something that we need to prepare for. And we need to think about how you do that when you're not actually there physically. Same thing goes for referral services. As I mentioned previously, it's really important to ensure that we have updated referral lists, understanding that the kinds of referrals have changed. And we need to test out those referrals and ensure that those referral mechanisms are actually working in the time of COVID-19. There is a great possibility that participants will talk about the challenges that they're facing. These challenges would have been triggered by the pandemic. Are we prepared to respond? And if not, we really should be. We shouldn't go out into the field without, considering, what it is that we can do to be helpful in this regard. And if we're not able to do so because of budget lines or whatnot, we need to think about how this might affect the emotional well-being of those that are actually collecting the data. So a lot to think about there. And everything that I've said on the previous slide feeds into the training considerations. Of course, in any training, when it comes to violence against children, you really have to follow the best practices. That is no less true currently in this pandemic time. And in addition to following the established best practices, we really need to add into our training protocols for remote interviewing, ways to assess safety, and so on and so forth. I've already talked about these things. But I think in addition, even practice sessions for doing remote interviews. We're used to having our sort of role plays face-to-face. Well, now you're not going to see whoever it is being interviewed. And so perhaps it's about role playing back-to-back so that you don't actually see the person that you're supposed to be interviewing, and you have a chance to get used to the idea that you really can't see anything. All you can do is hear, and so on and so forth. Piloting and practicing is extremely important. And I would say that we should be in piloting mode throughout the course of the data collection period, because in these uncertain times of the unknown, anything could actually happen at any time. When it comes to data quality, there are certain measures that need to be revisited. We need to think about before the interview and during the interview. Before the interview, it would be important to think about arranging for a pre-call, setting up the time for the interview, but also the location, ensuring that it will be a place that the respondent feels will be safe. We need to think about all sorts of issues, particularly in low resource settings, not just whether phones or devices are charged, but also whether there's even electricity to make that happen, whether people have the airtime in order to buy their internet bundles or whatnot. These are all very practical considerations. And during the interview with remote data collection, there's really a need to build and repeat statements in order to confirm understanding, and the need to consider the study tool. Is the study tool eliciting information that will make the respondent say something out loud in regard to violence? That itself could raise ethical issues when it comes to remote data collection. And researcher well-being, finally, is extremely important and really needs to be embedded within our protocols and processes. The idea that our researchers need as much protection as the participants. So we need to think of creative ways to support our research teams and not assume that they're actually prepared or willing to carry out this kind of research in this sort of time. They're facing their own stressors as well. And so we need to be sensitive to their financial constraints, and there are ways to do that. For example, paying some compensation upfront to give them that motivation to work on this difficult topic, and ensuring that those that they're collecting data from are cared for. So in conclusion, to safely conduct interviews on VOW remotely during this pandemic period, the value of the knowledge we're generating has to be clear, potential harms have to be discussed, and in-depth planning around risk mitigation needs to be undertaken. What should the research priorities be based on this presentation? I personally feel that there really needs to be a priority around developing and documenting appropriate violence against women research methods in the time of COVID-19. And that research policies should really have a focus on ethical and safety issues. Some of the solutions to the research restrictions right now, I think you can pick them out from the previous presentations, but I want to add on to that. Theoretical research, very safe. In addition to operations research or implementation research, research as a part of service provision, provided there's proper training, much safer than going from house to house. And there's always the opportunity to do retrospective research post-lockdown, given that lockdown situations keep fluctuating. Thank you. Well, this is the publication that will be released very soon.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much. Leva, we are going to move to the question and answer. So if I could get you to put the panelists' videos back up. For some reason, my video is not working, but hopefully we can have the panelists up on the screen. So first of all, I'd like to thank our panelists so much for a really very interesting set of presentations. Some of the things that really struck me, first of all, is I mean, I knew that there was a lot of work and evidence already on this issue. I failed to understand the extent to which there really is a lot of studies. At the same time, I think one of the other very salient items that came out from all three of your presentations was the difficulties in trying to get data that can help inform both researchers and policymakers, given the real challenges under these really extraordinary circumstances to collect this sort of data. Part of it is because as researchers, we have to do this remotely, and also from the perspective of the participants where we can't ensure their privacy. So what I'll do is I'll start maybe reading some of the questions from the audience, and I think we have also some questions from some of the WedLab members. So, but I'll start with a question from Mary Ajay. From the presentations, you mentioned low levels of women's employment as a risk factor for gender-based violence. Oh, Leva, I have lost the question now. There it is. Yeah. Okay. So if I guess the question is, how can we think about policy strategies that can prevent those sorts of questions, those sorts of issues? Are there? So just to reiterate. Sorry, I lost the question for a second there. So in light of the fact that low levels of employment is increasing the risk factor, what strategies can a policymaker take to try to prevent that? Yeah, so maybe I'll turn that over. I don't know who wants to answer that question first.
I'm happy to share a couple of thoughts since it came up in my presentation. Understanding the challenges of administering these kinds of programs during periods of lockdown at the forefront. At the same time, I think there could be innovative ways to transform certain kinds of programs to make resources available to women. So I mentioned the importance of cash transfers as a way to alleviate the economic stress of households, and livelihoods, restrictions on women. There could be remote ways of doing that in certain contexts where banking is done remotely, and microfinance programs can be administered remotely. The caution that I would underscore, which I think other panelists have done as well, is the importance of recognizing some of the risk when there's an injection of economic resources in a economically constrained household where there are high levels of stress, and the importance of ensuring that the normative environment is supported as well for women. So I think there could be some innovative mechanisms to modify cash transfers programs with the caveat and the importance of understanding the potential risks that may be associated with that as well.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if Chichi or Wilson, if you wanted to add to that.
Not to add to that, but I think I'll contribute to the next question I see up there.
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay, so this is from Dr. Kirti Nakray, and she's asking about any insights around the issue of doing her post-intervention survey with healthcare providers in low-income settings. And I would say I think you're really fortunate that that's actually your population. I see no reason why healthcare providers can't be interviewed at this time, and whether remotely or even in person, depending on whether services are actually, whether they're actually working right now. But I think that that's much less risky than trying to interview survivors or just women in general at this point. And I would definitely say go ahead and collect your data, whether it's via an online survey or whatnot.
Maybe adding to the conditional cash transfer programs, I think that kind of the big problem during pandemics with empowerment initiatives or giving money to people, to women, is that what evidence says is that you have also to work with men in order to not only empower women, but try to disinflate this aggressiveness of some men. And in the context of lockdown or low mobility, it's kind of very difficult to achieve the second component in order to provide the desired impact.
Yeah, I would underscore that as well. And another alternative in settings where that risk is considered to be high, a broader social protections approach that might take family economic hardship into account, recognizing the implications for children of school lockdowns, but an approach that provides resources to family members as a whole would be a way to mitigate some of those risks. So I think a lot of this is going to be context specific, but those are a couple of ideas that might be innovative considerations, taking the caveats into account.
Okay, thank you. Let me just scroll through our questions. There was Wilson, there was a specific question about your presentation. So this is a question from Eugenie Viatchin. I do apologize for mispronouncing your last name, Viatchinanova. The questions are first, in the case of Peru, have you noticed any initiatives undertaken by the local financial sector to support the fight against global-based violence, such as cooperation with Línea 100, etc.? And the second question is, do you see the role for the local financial sector to take part of this fight? If yes, which one?
Yes. Financial sector has not addressed or cooperated with the Ministry of Women or any issue on intimate partner violence. Their cooperation has been more and opportunities. Yes, I think there are kind of a couple. I would say first, in-house campaign, because it's not only financial sectors, but enterprises that have obviously women who can be affected by the intimate partner violence problems and that are now returning to work. We have the children at home who are not going to school. There's a lot of stress because of how gender roles are determined here in Peru. And the other is that Línea 100 is to to grow in terms of how it can be known by everybody, how it can be a possible option when some women or children face this risk. And I think here in Peru, kind of how we see this, how we see intimate partner violence is still a problem to be solved by the state and by women. And so the other part of the equation, men are kind of not still discussing how we can, from our part, how to keep it.
Great, thank you. All right. A question from Rachel McKenna from Kenya, who's noted that gender-based violence is a global problem, and not only in Kenya. Could it be the quarantine season that has helped women get to know their spouses better? Most of her friends feel that their spouses are narcissists. Could it be true, or these feelings will end after the quarantine? So I guess this is, oh, and also, are we expecting a high divorce rate post-COVID? So I guess this is also about the pandemic having a change on how women are perceiving their relationships, because they perhaps have more information, or they have a change in those perceptions as a result of that.
Well, I'm based in Kenya, Rachel, and I can say that, you know, those are really interesting theoretical questions. I know that, you know, you hear experiences on either side, some saying this period of quarantine and lockdown has helped to enrich their relationships, and others saying that others saying the opposite. So I think it's hard to say at this particular time, but we all understand that there are all kinds of pressures which can lead to conflict in the home. So it's not surprising to hear, you know, that a lot of people, a lot of friends you have are talking about their husbands being narcissists. I think that it is a lot of pressure to, you know, not really be able to go anywhere when you're used to going out to work or whatnot. And whether the divorce rate is going to increase as a result, I think it just remains to be seen. May I also touch on the other question I see here about shelters being closed down and, you know, what can be done to cater for survivors? There's an interesting model that Highest Kenya has used in urban refugee settings here in Nairobi to sort of expand access to shelters, because even in non-pandemic times, shelters are really very few and far between. And they use a sort of support system with women survivors who've been through a sort of capacity building program and who are interested in helping other women. And they open their homes to them and use them as shelters. So they take women to different communities in order to shelter them. That could be one solution. It seems to be working quite well for them.
Yeah. Chichi, I would really agree with you. I think in terms of the question about risks of divorce, that's where thinking a little bit about the social ecology of where violence may be occurring. There may be some settings where the risks of divorce are as high or greater, and the prospects for divorce may still be somewhat limited, either socially or even legally. And so I think the outcome of that is going to depend on the broader the legal and normative context and the capacity for women to seek divorce and to have the financial resources to do that as well, knowing the constraints on women economically right now. I also, Chichi, really agree with you that shelters are often limited and sometimes not a place where women are placed at the center in terms of their needs during experiences of violence. And this may be an unfortunate but an important opportunity to reconsider the ways in which shelters are situated and the kinds of guidance that women receive at those places in lower income settings and in settings in the United States and the West.
A couple of countries are sending victims to hotels paid by the state, of course. It's a very good alternative when there's no availability of shelters. And there's a question of if once the problem, the pandemics or the lockdown stops, intimate partner violence is going to return to its natural levels, I would say. And I think for some countries, the answer is much more difficult because at least in Peru, we will face a 2-year recession, economic recession. And so we will move to the drivers of intimate partner violence during pandemics to the drivers of intimate partner violence in economic depression. So we will have kind of a continuity between two different problems with one original problem, the virus. And the other subject I wanted to raise is that for some victims, I think it will be even harder to leave their partner after pandemics, because some research, what evidence says is that when women face more severe violence, it's much more difficult for them to report or to leave the relationship. So we cannot have this homogeneous vision of victims, and I hope that after the lockdowns, the states can understand this problem and deliver proper solutions so that these women finish their relationship.
Wilson, one comment that you brought up during your presentation, which I think is really important to think about in the context of understanding divorce and separation, is the potential for elevated violence in couples that may be unequal, but where violence is not occurring, the sort of situational violence that some family violence researchers don't call gendered, but have gendered underpinnings. And distinguishing the conflict that arises in those families from the kinds of sort of ongoing chronic domestic terror is the term that Johnson uses that I think you brought up in your presentation. So recognizing that it's not just the households where violence has been occurring, but that in unequal households where the strains are really high, the stresses and strains of lockdown, where inequitable couples can become part of circumstances of violence, and understanding the distinctions between the needs of those families is really important.
Yes, it's a very good point, and I would add a fifth typology of subtype of victims, that is the first-time victims, the first-time violence episode during the pandemics, that it never happened before, and maybe what the first time it happened has been during these months. No? And I think that research in this subject is very interesting, but I think that it's very difficult still to translate those results into the protocols from the state or the services in general to try to identify the needs and risk. What we have is these risk assessment tools that are very common in a lot of in the justice sector, when you face shelter, even in the helpline in the domestic violence helplines. But I think in general, we don't still have the correct tools to try to understand what is happening to that types of women, and to try to follow them during time in order to see what the state or what the service gave them is going to work or not.
We have a few more questions I want to get through, so perhaps I'll just take two at a time. So we have one question from Amber Petterman. As stakeholders interested in ending violence of various kinds, we're seeing high global attention to the issue. This is clearly an opportunity to focus additional resources and global movements towards it. But what should we do more concretely? Can the speakers reflect on actions we can take to capitalize on this wave of attention? So that's one question from Amber Petterman. A question from Jemima Njuki is about how to best capture and address sexual violence against adolescent girls and nuance it more. This is not being reported in the helplines or in most data collection, and is being left to health centers that are collecting data on teen pregnancy. The actual violence, sexual and physiological, is hardly being addressed. So how can we do better with this? So maybe if we can take those two, and we are still getting quite a few questions coming in. So, yep. Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can, I'll just thank Amber for the question and to say, well, that's a really big question, an important one. I'm not sure what the best answer to it is, but I would like to say that there really, I would like to agree, there really is this wave of interest, particularly given the interconnections between violence and COVID-19. And I think one thing that is important for us to emphasize, as much as we keep linking our violence research right now to COVID-19, one important message to emphasize is that the rates of violence were already high pre-COVID-19. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. It's not something that's going to disappear when the pandemic disappears. So it's an issue that continues to be with us, and it requires attention whether we're within pandemic circumstances or not. And I also wanted to say to, was it Rachel, about the nuancing of violence when it comes to girls. That's an important question, and I think I would love to discuss further, maybe off this webinar, a particular intervention that has to do with actually screening children for sexual violence. And the screening tool used really helped to give kind of more nuanced experiences of violence with children, talking about it in their own words. And it seemed to really help to promote disclosure. So I think there are solutions that may not, be very well known just yet, but there are solutions. Thank you.
Yeah, Chi-Chi, I'll take a moment. Amber's question is wonderful, and I wanted to also take a moment to address Jemima's question as well. I think it's really important, and this is sort of an ongoing discussion about disaggregation of gender disaggregation of data. The domestic violence call data is limited for the reasons we've discussed. It's also limited because it's not disaggregated in a way to understand the groups of women, including girls, that are at risk and are in situations where they're able to call and report. So the way in which gender are disaggregated is critically important. I think also to sort of expound on Chi-Chi's comment about the sensitivity and the need to be mindful about research protocols is making sure that we are very careful in the research protocols that we develop for minors, either for unmarried girls who are in the homes of their extended families, or married girls who were married at a young age and may be particularly vulnerable. We found sort of in a macro study that the legal environment, even if it's favorable, tends to be more protective of adult women when there are a constellation of supportive laws in place. And so girls do tend to have less protection even from existing laws. And so the circumstances now are probably going to be even more intensified for vulnerable girls. So thinking about more broadly about the types of violence to which adolescent girls are exposed, not only sexual violence, potentially in the extended family, cyber violence as they're getting exposed to online sources of schooling where that does exist, the pressures for child marriage, and really the importance of gender disaggregated data and ethical and responsible protocols that can tap information on this very sensitive topic.
I think the possibilities on what to do are big, but evidence in this particular moment is not very informative. But I can comment that we are raising funds to work with the Ministry of Women to evaluate, to run an RCT on sending text messages to give promotion to the Línea 100, in order to women start calling to the Línea 100 and try to connect needs and risk. And the other thing we are working that is kind of, I think it's a need, is to work on burnout in not in professionals who directly address victims, work with victims in intimate partner violence. We are working on another RCT, trying to give two different interventions to see how they work. And I mention this because I think that we kind of think that we have to build the service, but we tend to forget that there's people behind those services that can be very stressed at every moment in the day, and finally has also consequences on a bad service.
Okay, great. We still have quite a few questions, so maybe I'll take three and then pose them to the panel. So one is from Abhi Balakrishnan. Are there any opportunities for shifting discriminatory gender norms as a result of this pandemic? Which I think is a really fascinating question that I was also asking myself during the panel. Another question by Sam Nixon. Thank you, of course, to the presenters for the knowledge and time. The question has to do with gender-based violence in girls and how the shift in education during COVID, online, radio, TV learning, et cetera, can be leveraged to combat violence. And I know that some of the presentations did touch on that. So I think it would be great if we could sort of flesh that out a little bit more. And a third question from Franck Grimard. If someone were to be working at a development agency and the minister wanted to spend funds on GBV and COVID, where should the money go over the next 2 months? So those are those three questions, and then we'll see if we have time for some more.
Maybe a couple of quick reactions. Such an important set of questions, and I'm really glad they came up. I do think there are innovative ways in which we can address the normative environment with respect to GBV against women and girls. I think people increasingly have recognized that sort of persistent and equitable gender norms is a major contributor, an ongoing contributor. It's a contributor that's also potentially exacerbated as in the context of heterosexual relationships, men and boys access increasingly violent forms of explicit content on through different media venues. And this is something that's increasingly coming up in the media. So leveraging social media platforms, leveraging online platforms for educational and entertainment programming. We actually have a randomized trial underway in Southeast Asia where we are testing a social norms-based intervention strategy. This is a context where there continues to be good internet access. And so in those kinds of settings, innovative educational entertainment programs can be a way to mitigate some of the exposures that men and boys may have to explicit content and the normative environment more generally. We're also engaged in social norms-based programs that do leverage existing ongoing normative outlets such as radio and TV. So if lockdown situations continue to evolve and ebb and flow, these could be channels for effective interventions to address some of the inequitable norms that continue to influence risk of violence.
I'd like to take a stab at Frank's question. Another good and I guess sort of difficult one. But off the top of my head, I would say that I would let this minister know that funds can be spent in a couple of ways. One would be on research in the context of service provision. But first of all, even before that, I think a key theme would be funding GBV services so that they are regarded as essential services in the country during the time of COVID-19. And as part of that, funding research as part of service provision so we can understand from actual survivors the dynamics of violence during this time. And finally, I would want to fund innovative prevention strategies during this time.
I think every crisis is an opportunity to change things. And one of the most common responses from at least Latin American countries has been the communicational campaigns. and they are very interesting. They are, I think it's a must to do. But I think that we have to understand how every victim or how every woman in general can react to this kind of messages, because they can generate motivation, but not necessarily a behavioral change. And if I had to direct some funds to some important problems, at least from the context of Peru, I would say that protection orders are problematic. We have almost 400,000 protection orders at national level, and we have only 30,000 police who can follow them. So there is inevitably a gap in this system that we have to rethink in order to give a correct protection to victims.
Yeah, a final thing I would just very quickly add in the interest of time is that I think it's important to think about multifaceted approaches that can address some of the things that are exacerbated in the context of lockdown. So thinking about innovative ways of providing mental health services could serve as both a prevention and a response. Thinking about innovative ways to deliver social norms programming, again, potentially a prevention and response. So the line between prevention and response through online delivery formats and other sort of innovative formats, I think becomes a little bit blurred. And there are opportunities to use some of the same kinds of avenues for both purposes. So thinking in innovative ways about multifaceted programming delivered in innovative ways, I think could be very helpful for all women.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for wonderful presentations and question and answer session, very rich indeed. We have come to the end of our time, and so I'd just like to, on behalf of WEDLab, thank you all very much for participating, and also do a quick plug for our next two topics. The next two topics is going to be on girls' education and on social protection programs. So we are going to be revisiting some of these issues, and I'm almost certain that the topic of gender-based violence is going to also permeate throughout those talks as well. And do stay tuned on the Grow Research Twitter handle, where we will be announcing dates and times and registration links. So with that, again, a huge round of applause to thank you, a virtual applause, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really important discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.